All right. My name is Irene Levinson Schwartz, and the Levinson was, of course, my maiden name. My age is 94, and I was born June the 14th, 1922. My father lived in Bishopville, South Carolina, so naturally they settled in Bishopville. And when she was pregnant with me, she didn't want to go to the closest hospital, which was 60 miles away, and it took quite a while in those days to drive 60 miles. So she went home to her mother to give birth in New York City. And that is why I am claimed on my birth certificate to be a native of New York, when I really was a native of South Carolina.
And what kind of stories did your mother tell you about when you were a baby? Does anything stand out?
Well, I was a terrible baby. I cried all the time, so she wouldn't bring me home. She stayed in New York and took me from pediatrician to pediatrician. And finally my father called and said, "That's enough time to stay in New York, come." And he went up there and they saw a few more pediatricians. Finally they came home and settled, of course, in Bishopville, South Carolina. And my mother took me to a pediatrician in Columbia, South Carolina, where her brothers lived. So he found a formula that I actually liked, and it agrees with me. However, to make this formula, it took hours and hours, but I thrived on it, so that was the final point there to feed me. And it was a small knit community. My father had two sisters living there in the town, and we actually stayed in one of the homes with one of the sisters, my Aunt Rosa Levinson. She had married a Levinson also. And that's where I grew up my first 2 years. So my father decided, with my mother's pushing, she always wanted him to get out from under working with his brother-in-law. So we moved to Fairmont, and that was when I was 7 years old. And by that time I had a little brother named David, and David was born not in a hospital this time, but born there in a house in Bishopville, South Carolina, with the doctor was named Dr. Harris. And Dr. Harris took care of everybody in Bishopville, including births and abortions. But anyway, we moved to Fairmont. And when we arrived with the moving van, the house that my father had selected to redo was not ready, so we had to move into another house, which was called the Sledge House. He was formerly the owner of the lumber company that the little town of Fairmont was founded on, really. And so that's where we lived until my father found another house for sale and was able to buy it very reasonably. And I entered, when we moved there, it was in June, my 7th birthday, and I entered school, of course, in the fall there. And we lived in this house, and it was coal-fired furnace. We had never had that before. Down south, every house had a fireplace in every room. So we never really had good heat because my father really didn't know anything about how the registers worked. But anyway, we had fires in the living room too, and the kitchen was always warm. But for the first time in my life, I had seen a huge closet. This house was really built for the owner of the lumber company, and it was a large house with a large yard. So that's where we remained until my father bought another house. So about that same time, my father was in the store and a farmer brought in a little collie puppy. And we adopted this little collie puppy and named him Buster. And Buster was the love of our life for years. Buster had a very good home, but he was never trained, you might say. So one day, next door, there was a young woman living with her husband, and she was quite pregnant. And Buster was out playing with us on the lawn, and he came very happy dog, not one that would jump on her normally. But this time he was wagging his tail and she was walking down the steps and he did jump on her. Well, my family, my father and my mother became very upset, and Buster had to go. So my father had a very good clerk in the store named Roscoe, and he would eventually become the head clerk as the business grew. And so his father owned a farm, so they sent Buster out to the farm, and they tied him up on a rope, and Buster we thought he was settled there. Well, about 2 months later, Buster chewed through the rope and found his way home. But on the way home, one of his claws got caught in a trap that a farmer had set out for some animal, I don't know. And he came to our front door and barked. And so my father and my mother said, we have to keep Buster if he went through all that to come home. So that was the tale of Buster. And one morning she came in, I think it was a Sunday morning, maybe Easter morning, possibly, I think. And she lit this and it flared up, and it caused the fire. It went, and in the meantime, in the back bedroom along the back of the den, my older cousin was living there. He was living in the house there with us because he was helping my father in the store, working for him. And so she, instead of alerting him or anything, she went outside and started running around the house. Now, we were all sleeping upstairs, and my brother woke up and smelled smoke, and he woke us up. And we went down the stairs that led to this back den, and my dad opened the door, and the fire came out and actually singed his eyebrows. And so we all ran out the front door, and my mother, we had a piano that my grandmother had given to me, baby grand, in the living room. So my mother grabbed the Spanish shawl she had covering the piano and put that over herself, sent my David and myself next door to stay with the Lassiters. And Mrs. Lassiter was the older woman, the Paul Thompsons lived with her. So, of course, the volunteer fire department came, and we all knew, I mean, my father knew all the members, of course, because the town was so small. So they put out the fire, and Wilton McDaniel was upstairs listening to my father talk to him, and he said, and my father said, "Wilton, throw down my pants." And so Wilton says, "Harry, what in the hell do you want with your pants? They're sopping wet." And my father says, "Throw them down, Wilton." So Wilton threw them down, and my father pulled out a roll of bills. He had been playing poker. My father loved poker. He had been playing poker that Saturday night, and he had won this bunch of bills. Anyway, of course, the house was torn down. And my father had already bought a lot on the other side of town, but he decided he liked that area, and he rebuilt. My parents rebuilt right on that same lot.
And you said your mom worked in the store?
Oh, yes.
And did the whole family contribute? Did you work there too?
No. The only time I worked there was when I was, I think, maybe in high school, and they were very busy, and my father asked me to take over the cash register.
And what did your mom do at the store?
She was a saleswoman, and she went to New York when they went on buying trips, and she helped buy for the store. And of course, she loved going to New York because that's where her twin sisters lived, Rose and Ida. And she always wanted to visit them.
Tell me more about your mom's background, her family story, because I understand she came from Lithuania. Is that right?
It's Belarus today. Today it's Belarus. And there was a small town. I can't remember it. The reason why I know the small town is because her brother, my Uncle Meyer Katz, came from there when he was 15. And his son later gave me his passage. I can't remember what they called it. But anyway, we found out exactly where he came from. It was a small town in Belarus, which was then, of course, Russia.
So how did her family, I think I read that she came over when she was just a child with her brothers and with her sisters.
Well, her father came first. Their oldest daughter married and came to America. And then my grandfather came there and lived with them for a while. And I guess as he made enough money for the passage, he brought the rest of them, except for my Uncle Meyer, who came on his own. And he was very talented in languages. And his daughter later told me that that's the way he worked his way across the ocean, was writing letters for others, because he, of course, with this talent. So he came alone, and then my grandfather sent for my mother, her twin sisters, Rose and Ida, and her younger brother, Saul. And they all came to New York. They lived eventually, I guess, maybe like the rest of the Jewish people that came as immigrants on the east side for a while. But my grandfather originally was with his father in business with the lumber. I guess it was what they call lumbering, I don't know. But anyway, my great-grandfather, my grandfather's father, was partners, but they could not, a Jewish man couldn't own land, so he was in business with a non-Jewish person. And one day, as my Uncle Meyer told the story, his father came home and had a heart attack. Of course, we later found out it ran through the whole family, that this prevalence to heart attacks. So anyway, they were afraid. They became afraid. They thought, well, maybe his partner poisoned him. And so that's when they started the migration and to come to America. Peaches in those days didn't come without the fuzz. They were not defuzzed. But anyway, we lived next door to the Laneys, and Mr. Laney owned the stables down the street, and which was one of several stables in the town. And I used to play with his boys, and they would bring all these different creatures home, and one day he brought a goat and hitched it up to a wagon, and I remember riding on the wagon with the goat pulling. So, and also I remember sitting on the steps there watching when they were older boys, and when they were going to school, wishing I could go to school. Of course, I think they had a kindergarten that you had to pay for. It wasn't free. And my younger cousins went to that kindergarten, but my father didn't make enough money to go to the kindergarten, for me to go to the kindergarten. However, in that house, while we lived in that house, he bought his first car. And he said one day, he said, Irene, come on, come to the garage. I have something great to show you. And I thought, ooh, a new doll maybe, something, a new plaything. And there was this car. And I thought, oh, it's only a car. But anyway, that was the car that my mother loved. It was a little Dodge. And she would learn to drive, and she would visit her brothers that lived in Columbia, South Carolina at that time. And she had 3 brothers living there.
So tell me about starting school when you moved to Fairmont.
Okay, we moved to a little house, a stucco house, white stucco house, down 1 block north of where my Aunt Jenny lived, Jenny Kresnoff. And from there is when I entered school, first grade, and also at that same time, my Aunt Jenny's husband, Uncle Meyer's sister, moved to Bishopville, and she had a daughter exactly my age, Ruth Yaffe. And so my mother and Ruth's mother took turns taking us to school, because school was on the other side of town. So I remember going to the first grade, and I remember this one day, this girl came to school waving her arm she had a bracelet, a gold bracelet. And I thought, oh, that is so beautiful. I'll remember that. And everybody was standing around oohing and awing about this gold bracelet. But our little first grade was really in an additional little building from the apart from the larger building. And every day this teacher, the music teacher, would come in, and we have to sing, "Good morning to you, good morning to you." Every day, every morning. That was the beginning of our class. I had joined the Air Corps with the condition that he could stay in college until he was called up. So we were still able to go together. But then there came a time in my last year in college when he was called up. And he was called up in March 19 1943, and it really hit me. That really hit me, and so somehow I never felt the same towards the student rabbi, and so one time he was the one, but then for some reason this was war, and this was the fellow I had been going with had to be marched off to war. So it was a crazy time. It was a crazy time. It was not a normal time. And there weren't normal feelings either. They were not just, you had to accept what was going on. So I stayed in college and I graduated in 1943. And then I went home. And my father found a job for me on the tobacco market. I worked in one of the warehouses as not a secretary, but it was a position that I had. And I would work with the ones that wrote up the sales of the warehouse sales from the tobacco. So of course all the fraternity boys had to attend. That was one of the priorities that they had to do. So that was where I met my husband. And I loved to dance. I was a great dancer, if I must say so. And anyway, I danced there with several fellas, and I went back to my dorm, and I get this phone call. We had this house mother downstairs. She says, "You have a phone call," and you went in the hall and answered the phone, and this boy says, "I'd like to see you tonight. I'd like to have a date." And I didn't know who it was. And I thought it was this fella that really was a good dancer, so I said, okay. So when they called me from downstairs to come down, that you have a caller, they called it. So I went downstairs to see this blind date, and I didn't see him. And this fella was sitting like with his back to me. He was talking to somebody, and he stood up, and I said, "Oh no, that's the worst dancer." And so we went out, and that was the beginning. And I figured, well, he's a fraternity brother. I'll go to some fraternity dances anyway. She spoke to her mother. Her mother visited Fairmont. I can remember the visit when I was 9 years old. And that's when she bought me the piano. And we were walking home from downtown one day, and she was asking me all kind of questions and tried to talk to me. But her accent was so heavy, I couldn't understand it. So later on, my mother said, "Didn't you know what your grandmother said? She asked you how you liked living in Fairmont." I would have answered her, "I don't know any other place."
That's great.
But that's the vivid remembrance that I have of her. And we have pictures taken too in front of that house, where the first house we moved into.
That's great.